Hello everyone, Crow here, and welcome to another episode of GameThing. The game I'm talking about in this episode is Saturday Night Slam Masters on both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. As you can see, I've got a side-by-side comparison set up here, so as I kind of talk about this game, you can kind of see the differences between the Genesis and the Super Nintendo version. Now, there are some pretty major differences between the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions, but I'll get to those later. What I first want to mention is that the reason I'm doing this game is because it was requested by the Upset Luchador way back last year sometime. However, when he requested it, I did not have the game for neither the Super Nintendo or the Genesis. And I picked up the Super Nintendo version sometime late last year, and I was planning on doing a quick clips and maybe even a Crow Plays on it, but I kind of discontinued the Crow's Plays series. So then I was going to do a GameThing episode on it, but then recently I got the Genesis version as well, so I figured I'd do a kind of, talking about the game and kind of comparison, what makes the Genesis version different from the Super Nintendo version. But before we get into all of that, let's talk about this game in general. This game was released in the arcades in 1993, and it fits within the same universe as Final Fight and Street Fighter. It was released 4 years after Final Fight, and it was released in between Street Fighter II Hyper Fighting Edition and Super Street Fighter II. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because it really does have pretty close ties to both these games. With Final Fight, Hagar from Final Fight is one of the main characters in this game, and depending on whether or not you're looking at the US or the Japanese version of this game takes place before or after Final Fight. Because according to the US version, in Hagar's bio, it explains that he's the former mayor of Metro City, which would have indicated that he was the mayor during Final Fight. But in the Japanese version, this is treated like a prequel to Final Fight, whereas Hagar was the wrestler before he became the mayor. Now, I also want to say that the gameplay is a lot like Final Fight as well. The controls are really simplistic, and they could be applied to a side-scrolling beat-em-up game. You have one button to attack, one button to jump, and that's really all you needed in Final Fight, I think. And but you also have one more additional solely to pin, so there's no questioning whether or not you want to pin somebody or not. Now, this game also has a little bit of ties to Street Fighter II in terms of gameplay, in that each character does have one special move. Now, it kind of varies per character, and it's not too hard to perform, and usually you could do it just by hammering the attack button or by pushing the attack and jump button at the same time. It's nothing as complicated as a Duken or anything. Plus, also, each character has a finisher type move that can be done during a grapple. It's not necessarily to finish the map, but it's like an individual move that each person has. But this game has stronger ties to Street Fighter II in terms of characters. A lot of character quotes and whatnot are directly referencing Street Fighter. For example, there's a character, Gunlock, that looks a lot like Guile, where in his bio says he's related to a famous Street Fighter. Other examples of this are like characters like King Rastaman, who resembles a lot like Blanca, especially some of his moves and techniques like the headbite. And also Biff Slamkovich, which almost looks like a prototype from Alex from Street Fighter 3. And also the character Titanic Tim, whose outfit looks exactly like T-Hawk's from Super Street Fighter 2. With all that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the gameplay. Like I said before, the gameplay is really easy. There's only 3 buttons. You have an attack button, you have a jump button, and you have a pin button. Now, I'm not too familiar with wrestling games of today. In fact, Saturday Night Slam Masters is one of the last wrestling games I've ever played. And I enjoyed it because there's an arcade style. There's really no learning curve. You go in there, you hammer the attack button to attack, you could jump attack, you grapple, you push in a direction, and you hit buttons, and the characters do things. When you could try and pin your opponent at just about any time, but if their energy meter's out and they're on the ground and you pin them, it's almost guaranteed you're going to get a 3 count. Another interesting feature is sometimes when you go out of the ring, there'd just be like a chair or table or something laying on the ground you could attack your opponent with. And to me, that just kind of adds a little bit to the excitement of the game. In addition, one thing I didn't notice for a while is that when like exciting things are happening, like grapple or something like that, or somebody's on the ropes, the crowd goes wild, and you can see them snapping more and more pictures in the background. And I just thought that was a cool feature to add to the game. Now, what we've been watching in this comparison is the single match one-on-one version of the game, which can be played 1 or 2 players. And the reason for that is it's because it's the only mode that is similar between the Genesis and the Super Nintendo version. So that being said, let's talk a little bit specifically between the differences between both versions, starting with the Super Nintendo version. So the game mode that the Super Nintendo version has, that the Genesis version doesn't have, is called Team Battle Royale. And what it is it's basically you and another wrestler in the ring against another team of 2 wrestlers, all wrestling at the same time. There is no tag team, it's just everybody in the ring at once. Now, what makes this mode really fun is the fact that it supports the Super Nintendo multi-tap, meaning you could have you and 3 of your friends all playing this game at the same time in this mode. Now also, I didn't mention this, but in the single match mode, there are 2 characters you cannot select. And they are kind of like the sub-boss and boss of the game. Well, in this mode, they are selectable for you to use. So overall, it's a pretty fun mode to have in addition to the game, especially if you have a lot of people to play this game with. Now, the reason I think this mode was not included in the Genesis version is because I don't think that they could have made the game to handle so many characters in the ring at once on the Genesis. I mean, even if you look at the Genesis footage, in single mode match, the referee isn't even in the ring, and he is in the Super Nintendo version. So I'm thinking that that's the reason why this mode wasn't included in the Genesis version. So what does the Genesis version have? Let's find out. Instead of having the Team Battle Royale mode, the Genesis version has a Death Ring mode, basically. It's very much like the standard mode, except that the ropes are now barbed wire, so when you throw them into the ropes, they kind of explode. There are objects inside the ring, and when you use them up, people actually throw more stuff into the ring. But aside from that, it's basically pretty much exactly the same as the regular single-player mode. Now, if you're watching this footage and wondering why both characters are kind of acting strangely, it's because this mode is only for 2 players and the CPU will not control the other character. So basically, when I was playing this, I was actually playing with both controllers at once. Now, when I was talking about the Battle Royale mode in the Super Nintendo version, I'd mentioned that there were 2 more characters available, the sub-boss and the boss of the regular single match mode. And these characters are also available for selection in this mode as well. However, because I think that this deathmatch is kind of a lackluster replacement for the Battle Royale, they put those 2 additional characters for selection in the single match mode as well. So that's kind of a one-up that the Genesis has over the Super Nintendo, in just the single match mode even. And there is really no way to get those characters in the Super Nintendo version in the single match mode, because unless I guess maybe Game Genie, but there are no hidden codes or anything to unlock them. So overall, which version of the game do I like better? Well, without hesitation, I can say that the Super Nintendo has better graphics, sound, and even digitized voice sounds a lot better on the Super Nintendo. But the Genesis version, it just seems a little bit more playable. Like, the control is a bit tighter and it felt a little bit easier to play. But then again, I do like the Battle Royale mode that is in the Super Nintendo version better than the deathmatch in the Genesis version. So I really think it depends on whether or not you want to play this with 4 people or not. If you wanted to play with 4 people, then go with the Super Nintendo version. But if you want a better gameplay experience, I guess go with the Genesis version. But you have to think that nowadays it really is inconsequential. I mean, you can pull up MAME and actually play the arcade version of the game. But back when the Genesis and the Super Nintendo were out, people either had one or the other. Very few people actually had both. And, you know, if you had a Super Nintendo, you're okay with the Super Nintendo version. If you had a Genesis, you're okay with the Genesis version. That's really all there is to it. So as for Saturday Night Slam Masters as a whole, what I liked about it was just the simplistic control. There's really nothing complicated about this game. And the fact that it has a dedicated pin button just shows that they want this game to just be pick up and playable. And what I didn't like about the game are kind of nitpicky things, but the main thing is that all the arenas look the same. Basically, it's just a color change from location to location to location. And even the crowd and the stadiums all look the same. There's absolutely no change. And honestly, at the end of the day, I'd rather be playing Street Fighter 2. I mean, this is good for a change of pace, but I don't think it's the kind of game that can hold people as long as Street Fighter 2. I mean, you know, Street Fighter 2 has gone on to Street Fighter 3, and now Street Fighter 4, it's still going. And while Saturday Night Slam Masters did have 2 sequels, it pretty much ended by 1994. And that is Saturday Night Slam Masters in a nutshell. Upset Luchador, consider my promise fulfilled. And everyone, I'll see you all next time. Bye. 1, 2, 3.